Hi everybody!
Metaphor ReFantazio is the fastest Atlus title to reach 1 million sales, achieving it on just its first day on the market. This made it one of 2024's breakaway successes. It's a game that also explores a lot of deep and uncomfortable topics, ones which I will dig deeper into with another video essay in fact. I'll be doing a few of those in the coming weeks and months, so consider hitting the subscribe button to ensure you don't miss them. Just like Atlus wants Metaphor to be its third pillar, maybe you could become a future pillar of my community. Anyways, for this review, we'll start by covering some of the history and development of this game, then move into the good, and then the bad. The game originally had a different name when it was announced in October of 2016. It was called Project ReFantazio, with notable Atlus veteran Katsura Hashino establishing a brand new studio within Atlus to begin working on the project. It also included other Atlus veterans, with Shigenori Sojima providing art and music by composer Soji Meguro. For Metaphor, the soundscape is a rather important aspect of the game that might be covered more later into the video. So, why was this fledgling dev team comprised of senior Atlus staffers established? It was because Hashino wanted to work on something quite different from what the Persona franchise was becoming, and taking gaming back to the types of games he grew up playing akin to Dungeons & Dragons or other tabletop RPGs. This definitely shines through in both the gameplay and the narrative. Hell, if you told me Metaphor was just in fact members from Persona games getting together once a week to play a tabletop RPG together, I'd have bought it. This both works in favor of Metaphor and at times to its detriment, but more on that later. After the game was announced, information would periodically trickle out, but it wasn't much. At points, you could almost pop up this title's game over screen, and that would describe the general sentiment of the nihilistic Atlus fans. However, that nihilism turned to confusion in June of 2023 when Atlus revealed Metaphor as one of its offerings during that year's Xbox showcase. The confusion stemmed from the fact no one really knew if this game was going to be an Xbox exclusive or not. Obviously, it turned out not to be, and I personally think that would have killed any sales potential this game had at the time. But generally speaking, Xbox gamers just don't do JRPGs. Anyways, that's enough waffling on about the history of Metaphor's development. Let's get into discussing my thoughts on the game proper. I'll admit there's a lot to like about Metaphor. While I feel some of the characters are generally speaking much less interesting than others, you meet a really colorful cast of them throughout the game's almost 100-hour runtime. In my first playthrough, I racked up 97 hours of playtime, which is on the shorter side for an Atlus title, as I've easily put 120 plus hours into modern Persona games when I play those. The story, while a little bit basic on its surface, is actually incredibly good once you start getting into the weeds, being packed full of topics for the player to ponder over. Though the most obvious one on a surface level would be racism is bad, which, no shit, Sherlock. But it's a message that the world needs pounded back into its skull again, thanks to recent events. But with an RPG, you need more than just a really good narrative to be a compelling package, which is something studios like Naughty Dog need to relearn, as their games are nothing more than shitty walking simulators at this point.
Tell me when I'm telling lies!
So, how is the gameplay of Metaphor? It's actually one of the better JRPGs out there in recent times, which is saying a lot as fans of the genre have been eating well since at least 2017. A lot of people, though, have said Metaphor is just Persona or SMT with a fantasy skin. And to that, I say...
You serious?
That's actually something I'll do a video on in the future, so like this one if that idea sounds good. But what is it about the gameplay that makes Metaphor stand out from the other games on the market? It's mostly down to it having fun, but admittedly not exceptional, hybrid combat. The action side of it, while nice when grinding, does not exactly feel as refined as I would have liked. However, given this is Atlus's first attempt at an action game since the PlayStation 2 era, some of the jank can be forgiven. It's clear that it'd be smoothed out in a sequel, and since this is Atlus's fastest game to 1 million copies, which by most metrics is a very good one in the games industry, I'd say it's just a matter of time before we're back in Uchronia. Plus, the way the game ends very much implies we're getting a sequel down the line. Place your bets in the comments section on when we'll get the second game. If this channel is still around by the time the second game releases, maybe I'll do a giveaway of a digital copy to the first person that gets it right. But if the action-based combat isn't the most refined, why am I saying this title has good gameplay? It's because of how good this variant of the Shin Megami Tensei press turn system is. It's not quite as easy to break as the one more variant found in the Persona games, but it's also not as luck dependent as an SMT title is, which people say is a hard franchise. I wouldn't exactly call either SMT or Metaphor hard games. I would just say they reward players who obsess over finding every little advantage they can. They give you all the tools to figure it out, lest you find yourself in a dig up stupid type of situation from The Simpsons. Metaphor makes exploiting this version of the press turn system all the easier to manipulate thanks to its job system called archetypes. By spending mag, the player is able to buy skills from the other classes you've had that character studying, which leads to the potential to make some pretty interesting and lethal combos if you know what you're doing and spend enough time to learn the ins and outs of the system. When talking with friends who also played the game, none of us had ever ended up with quite the same builds at the same point in the game. In fact, the job system is so freeform, you can pretty much make each character really unique, which is something you don't often see when it comes to RPGs with traditional job systems. While the archetypes on offer are interesting and almost infinitely customizable in the later stages of the game, the job system has its own share of flaws, but more on that for the bad section of the game. How does this variant of the press turn system work though? Basically, you exploit a weakness, it eats up half a press turn icon, and gives you more turns to work with. The same is also true for the enemy though. If they hit one of your weaknesses, they get more turns, and depending on the situation, it may cause the status effect called anxiety. Speaking of, anxiety is one of the core themes of the game, so to see it represented mechanically is actually good game design. There is more nuance to the system than just this, but that's the gist of it, and it's honestly best if you experience the game for yourself to see it in action. This review is more to get my thoughts on the game out there, and yap about an admittedly flawed game that I do like. Is there anything else I like about the game though? In fact, there are a few things. One of those would be the shorter social link system found in Metaphor. Every time you do a social link, it advances one rank, which is a good thing I found. I also like that there's only 8 ranks instead of 10 like in Persona. In those games, there are times where I just found the social link didn't really advance, despite you going up a level, either because the payoff in the sub-stories were subpar, or thanks to the confidant ability being mediocre and underwhelming, which is something Studio Zero have corrected significantly with Metaphor, as I feel like every confidant ability is useful to some degree, even if I have some complaints about how it's ultimately handled. With Metaphor, all of the abilities feel good. Also, truth be told, there is only one character whose social link I never really connected with, and maybe it's a me thing, but I found myself glazing over one character's dialogue, but hey, at least there's only one filler compared to the handful found in Persona games, so that's definitely progress in cutting out the fat. The music in this game is also top-notch, and I don't have much to say about it other than the chanting can get stuck in my head for days on end after hearing it. Continuing with food analogies though, it's time for me to stop waffling on about the things I liked. Now we're moving on to what I don't like about the game so much, and I think I will get some heat from the Metaphor stans who watch this video and can't accept that nothing is perfect. But c'est la vie. I'll admit there's precious few things that I actively dislike about Metaphor ReFantazio. That's why it was in my top contenders for Game of the Year last year. I covered what my actual Game of the Year for last year was in a collab for another channel called Frames. A link will be in the description so you can check that out if you're interested. But I'll say this, it's connected to my catchphrase at the end of every video. So let's start with one thing I found to just be regarding the game. It's not my biggest issue, but it is there. I found Juna's social link to be tedious. I'm not sure what it was, but I just found it boring. Maybe it's down to it coming about relatively late in the game, and by that point, I was just wanting the ride to be over. Which is an issue I find myself facing with most Atlus games. There comes a point where the pacing just grinds to a halt, and even if the gameplay is absolutely amazing, I either need to take a very long break or drop the title entirely. I always slog through though. But I noticed this to be especially bad for the last third of Metaphor. It almost feels like the game would have been more enjoyable as a 60-hour experience versus the extra 30 or so we experience. But since we're on that subject, I'll point to the parts of the game I found the most egregious. I'm talking about the Dragon Temple. That was one part that really dragged my experience down, as the ear monsters were super annoying and I found they were just there to waste your resources and time. I did manage to get through it, but I had to brute force the game. They also showed up again in the penultimate dungeon, and they were just as much of a piss-off then, if not more so, since I was already at a point where I just wanted to move on to other games. However, I'm glad I persevered, as this game is a truly magical experience once you go through it. This was just my one negative that brought the game down from being a nearly perfect game to just being a very good one. I also disliked how finicky the lock-on to enemies could be. However, it wasn't the end of the world, which is certainly something the sequel will have to address. But is there anything else I feel was bad or needed improved within the game? There is, but they're mostly nitpicks. Things like royal archetypes being a little bit underwhelming and some classes coming so late into the game along with certain party members that it feels like you barely got time to use them. Again, not the biggest or worst thing, but I feel like by the time you unlock the royal archetypes, you should get a class that feels truly special. Whereas right now, with how Studio Zero implemented them, they just feel like marginally better options to what you already have. The Prince archetype was especially underwhelming to me. Another thing I want to bring up, and it might just be a me issue, I found that when exploring cities, towns, and some dungeons, I would get stuttering a little bit before and after the loading splash screen. I'm not sure if this was just something I experienced or not, since no other reviews seem to mention it. I played this game on the base version of the PlayStation 5. I also noticed the issue persisted when I moved the game to a slightly faster aftermarket M.2 drive. While still there, the stuttering was a little bit smoother after the change. To summarize my thoughts on Metaphor, it's a very good game bordering on the edge of greatness. Where it excels, it really does. And where it's weak, the game is incredibly weak, or just a tweak away from being exceptional. What Atlus have at present with this game is a good foundation from which to build, and if they do, they are going to have something that could rival both SNT and Persona, the two franchises it shares the most DNA with. Also, something else I wanted to bring up, but didn't feel it deserved to be brought up during the bad section, nor did I feel like it was deserving of a separate one to talk about. I feel like had Studio Zero added more things to do in the Gauntlet Runner, along with giving the player more options to explore with it, would have been a great thing. Admittedly, I could not explore the whole of Uchronia in just one playthrough, something Atlus themselves were very upfront about. that you'd have to play the game at least twice to experience everything there is to offer, and I definitely will manage to do that next time I play. However, that won't be for a while, since even with a break, the game still managed to burn me out towards the end. But I feel like Atlus did that deliberately, so that it'd be a metaphor of life. Just like Tartarus in Persona 3 is meant to represent the grind of life, one that only ends once you've breathed your last. So until next time, keep blazing that trail.